It started small, with just a few people walking into the pines on a cold March day. It was 1990, and the town council of Oka, a small municipality west of Montreal, had just voted to expand a golf course into that pine forest. The problem was that expansion would be built on the traditional common land of the Kanehsatake Mohawks. The white pines would be cut down, fairways and putting greens would be placed on top of the graves of their ancestors. The Mohawks tried to appeal to all levels of government, and while they had successfully delayed construction, Oka was determined to push the development through. So the Mohawks organized and hit the streets to protest.
200 Mohawks from the Kanehsatake Reservation. They're protesting plans to expand the golf course in Oka. The Mohawks say the plan encroaches on their land.
But it was clear that they weren't changing any minds. Some Mohawk men and women wanted to make sure that the developers didn't pull a fast one on them and start cutting down trees in secret.
A few of the Mohawks said, we've got to do something. We've got to do something more to stop this from happening.
That's Loreen Pindera, a retired CBC reporter and the co-author of People of the Pines, The Warriors and Legacy of Oka. They wanted people in the woods patrolling in case anyone tried to come in and begin construction. So on March 10th, 1990, one Mohawk man, Walter David, borrowed a friend's truck.
And at that point, he organized to pull a fishing shack into the pines and set it up in the pine forest in the snow. And a handful of people lit a little fire and stayed out in the cold overnight.
And that was how the occupation began. No one knew it at the time, but this was the start of the longest military standoff on Canadian soil in over a century. The first month was bitterly cold. The people in the pines put up a temporary barricade on the road to block people from coming into the woods, but that was soon taken down, so they created a bigger one.
The Mohawks of Kanehsatake and Oka put up this barricade 8 weeks ago. Someone destroyed it. So the Mohawks brought in these concrete blocks. They say they're determined to keep them here.
What you are looking at here is a statement by the Mohawk people of Kanehsatake that this entire area here is our land.
But the mayor of Oka, Jean Ouellette, was determined to get his golf course.
According to what we have and the papers we have on hand, it belongs to the municipality of Oka.
Oka City Council got a judicial injunction against the Kanehsatake Band Council to take down the barricades. The Mohawks ignored it, and as the occupation continued, Mohawks from other communities like Kahnawake and Akwesasne arrived to lend a hand. Some of them were seasoned warriors, veterans of militant actions on both sides of the Canadian border. They brought with them military know-how and guns. By the time July had rolled around, the situation was tense. Mohawk warriors were secretly patrolling the pines alongside the many women and men protesting in the forest. The Quebec government was demanding that the blockade come down. The Mohawks defied another judicial injunction. But the Sûreté du Québec, the provincial police force, promised that as long as no criminal acts took place, they wouldn't intervene. Negotiations were taking place behind the scenes to try to avoid violence, and more warriors were streaming into the pines every day. But on July 9th, someone slashed the tires of a car belonging to one of the most vociferous supporters of the golf course expansion. The SQ said that this was a criminal act and that it gave them the justification they needed to move into the pines. The Mohawks got ready.
Some of the Mohawks had spent the entire night digging trenches and fortifying their barricades on either side of the pine forest.
On the morning of July 11th, the Mohawks in the pines got up at sunrise.
On that particular morning, John Cree, who was a faith keeper in the community, had gotten up and sang some prayers, and he was surrounded by women and girls, really 12 or 15 women and girls.
They got a call from a Mohawk woman in Oka who saw police cruisers headed towards the pines. The SQ was coming.
When the police arrived, Some of the women who were camped out in the pines were still sleeping in their tents, but they heard all this commotion. And very quickly, those who had gathered at the fire were joined by those who were just waking up.
The SQ demanded to see the Mohawks' leader. When they were greeted by Ellen Gabriel, a Mohawk woman in her 30s, and other Mohawk women, the cops guffawed. The Mohawks refused to budge, and the tensions rose through the morning. The Mohawk woman stood in front of the blockade, arm in arm. A helicopter was circling overhead, and the SQ had brought a front-end loader to dismantle the barricades.
By now, the police are running out of patience. Someone turns the engine on, they roar up the front-end loader, it starts to move forward and takes a swipe at the barricade, and Ellen yells, "This is their justice system! What the fuck kind of people are they over a goddamn golf course and their fucking greedy lust for money?" And at that point, there's tear gas being lobbed in and concussion grenades.
The Mohawk warriors remained in the pines, many of them armed with semi-automatics.
One woman even yelled, "Where are our men? Where are our men?" Because they were sort of holding steadfast in front of this small barricade, but now the front-end loader's coming towards them. Some of the warriors are basically from behind telling women, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." And one of the other women says, "You're going to be in the line of fire." The front-end loader roars to life. It moves up towards the barricade. Women begin to scatter. People are screaming. Tear gas is all over the place. The police now, many of them have pulled gas masks over their face, and they're running into the pines. Only a few meters are ever separating them. They don't have a long way to go. And then we hear the gunshots.
They're coming in. They're coming in. The cops are in. Cops are in. Oh. It's gunfire.
Come on, in a bush. Go!
A CBC reporter was in the pines, reporting live.
The support for this particular roadblock at Oka, what is happening there?
You can hear firing. I'm not sure if it's weapons or if it's... yes, it is. They're firing at us. I can see... I'm trying to get behind a tree, actually, and the tear gas is starting to come. But as you can hear, there's semi-automatic weapon fire. I can't tell for sure where it's coming from, but it appears to be coming from the police lines, yes.
And it doesn't last long. 19, 20 seconds, and it's all over.
After the shooting stopped, the SQ realized that one of their men was down. Corporal Marcel Lemay, a 31-year-old officer, was shot dead on the pine forest floor.
As soon as the police realize that a man is down, and we're talking seconds here, some of them rush forward, they pull him back, and then it's just complete chaos. The police, some of them running down the hill, discarding their police cruisers, leaving them behind them, and the raid is completely botched. The police have just abandoned it. No one expected, clearly, this level of violence, that someone should die.
As this battle in the pines was taking place, about a 40-minute drive away, Mohawk warriors in Kahsennahawi heard what was happening. They jumped into their cars and blocked off the highway that connects the southern suburbs of Montreal with the city. And they took control of the Mercier Bridge, stopping tens of thousands of people headed to work. What had started off as a small blockade on a side road had escalated to a national crisis. And now, a man was dead.
As soon as it was clear that a police officer had been killed, everything changed. From that moment, from 8:40 a.m. on July 11th, the moment that Marcel Lemay was killed, this was no longer about the expansion of a golf course. This was about the need for retribution over the death of this police officer.
To the police on one side of the barricade, this was a dispute about a golf course that had gotten out of hand at shocking speed. But for the Mohawks, this was just the latest in a centuries-long fight for land and justice that continues to this day. the Oka Crisis would last 78 days. It was the longest military confrontation on Canadian soil in more than 100 years. But it was just another example that at the heart of this country lie innumerable thefts. Land has been stolen out from under Indigenous peoples since before Canada's founding, but from the beginning, they have stood up and tried to fight back. I'm Arshy Mann, and from Canadaland, this is Commons. In 1990, Dan David was living in Maniwaki, which today is Gitgan Zibi, about 90 miles north of Ottawa.
I moved there with my girlfriend at the time. Her family comes from there, and we wanted to get away from the city. We wanted to get away from our families, and we just basically wanted to start a new life together.
Dan is a Mohawk man who grew up in Kanehsatake. For much of the 1980s, he worked as a reporter for CBC News. By the time the barricades were going up in his home community, he felt like he was done with journalism. And as he was trying to settle down into his new life, he kept hearing from his family about what was happening in and around Kanehsatake.
I got these calls from my sister back home here at Kanehsatake, and she kept saying, things are really getting very tense around here.
Many of Dan's relatives were in the Pines the day of the SQ raid. And when Dan heard about what had happened, he got in his car to go back to Kanehsatake.
I didn't know what I was getting into when I drove down from Maniwaki at the time. I remember driving like hell, not seeing a bloody cop all the way, until I actually arrived at the territory, and there was this roadblock, and I knew that something serious was going on, something very, very serious. I got through the roadblock okay. I got into the Pines, started looking around for my family because I knew they would be there. I knew that even my mother and father, my mom was in a wheelchair. My dad was a disabled American veteran, and they were old, and I knew that they would be nowhere else except in the Pines that day. I don't think they were there during the shooting, but I know that they were there immediately afterwards. And everybody expected there was going to be a second raid, and the second one would be bloody as all hell. So I'm wandering around the woods and looking for my family, trying to figure out where they were, if they were okay, if they had been hurt.
Dan's sister was a reporter for the local Mohawk radio station, so he was worried she might have been hurt in the melee. And Dan knew his brother, Joe David, had also been in the Pines that day. Joe was an artist who had joined the protest in the Pines early, but he had been adamantly opposed to any violence.
They called him Gandhi before that summer because he was such a pacifist, and I knew that he was, and I knew that he had studied Buddhism and he had looked at various kinds of religions, studying them and trying to come to terms with that sense of feeling like a cultural refugee in your own land. Well, that's what he was. He was lost. He was looking around as an artist, trying to figure out who he was and how to express himself in a strange world. So I'm wandering around the woods, and I happen to see this man, and I could recognize by his figure, that this is my brother Joe, and he's wearing camouflage fatigues, and he's got this bandana around his face, but I can still recognize him. And he's holding an AK-47, and I remember that he had taped them together so that he could flip them around very quickly. You fire one, empty it, and slap in the other one very quickly. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is my brother. This is Joe. He had decided to become a very staunch pacifist. He hated violence. And yet here he was in the woods carrying a weapon and prepared to kill or be killed. And I was just stunned. I didn't know what to say.
Dan David knew that he had to do something too, just like his brother.
So I was committed just like he was, but not to carrying a gun, but to carrying a recorder and a notepad.
Dan David understood that the weight of history was pressing down on this moment. his brother, and other warriors in the Pines weren't the first Mohawks to fight for that specific piece of land or even to take up arms for it. The Mohawks were one of the founding nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, the primary political force of their time. As the French began to come down the St. Lawrence River, the Mohawks and other Iroquois often fought with the new arrivals. But by the early 1700s, they were mostly at peace, and many converted to Catholicism. The St. Lawrence Valley had been a hunting ground for the Mohawks, and more now began to settle there near the town of Montreal. Some lived under the tutelage of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, a Roman Catholic order. And in 1717, French King Louis XIV granted the Sulpicians lands to the west of Montreal to create a mission.
Kanehsatake was originally a land grant made by the King of France, and it was huge. It went from here, where we are, on the shores of the Lake of Two Mountains, north all the way to St. Jerome, which is probably about 25 miles away.
And the whole idea was that the land was turned over to the Sulpicians for the use and benefit of the Indians of the mission, on the express condition that the title would revert to the crown if the Indians ever vacated the mission.
In other words, the Sulpicians were to look after the land on behalf of the Mohawks, but it didn't belong to them. The priests were granted a far smaller parcel of land, but the Sulpician order quickly began to find ways to strip away Mohawk territory for themselves.
Churches were given these tracts of land to, quote, educate and civilize the Indians, but they were really massive land scams where the church would sell out the land once French settlers moved and once the threat of any kind of war kind of disappeared.
But the Mohawks always maintained that the land was granted to them. After all, it had been their territory before the French had ever even set foot in the St. Lawrence Valley. And then the King of France had further cemented their claim.
And they started fighting for title right then, like starting in 1736.
When the British took control of New France, the Mohawks continued to demand recognition of their title to the land. They did this roughly every decade. In 1781, in 1788, 1794, 1802, 1818, 1828, 1839, 1848. But unlike the Mohawks of Kahsennahaway, whose lands were recognized by the courts, the Mohawks at Kanehsatake were denied over and over and over again. The Sulpician priests began to sell parcels of land to European settlers, often for enormous profits. And they would do everything they could to take it out from under the Mohawks and the other indigenous people who are already living there. If a Mohawk person went to work somewhere else for a season, the Sulpicians would simply take their homes.
So if they went to look for work someplace for longer than 3 weeks, their land could be seized and sold out from under them. And that was a favorite tactic that the church used to whittle away a lot of the land.
And the Sulpicians turned to even more aggressive tactics. After a young Mohawk chief named Joseph Onesagenarat petitioned Parliament to recognize their land claims, the priests threatened to excommunicate everyone involved. In response, the Mohawks decided to excommunicate themselves. In 1869, most of the Mohawks of Kanehsatake had converted to Protestantism. Joseph Onesagenarat died under mysterious circumstances at age 35, but he wasn't the last Mohawk chief to resist the Sulpicians or their backers in the Canadian government.
My great-grandfather was Joseph K. Gabriel. He was known as Ganadas in other terms outside, but he was Ganawardiardo to us here in the community. My great-grandfather brought back what we call the fire.
Joseph Gabriel saw the religious control that first the Sulpicians and then other Christian groups had been able to exert on the Mohawks. And he tried to bring back the Longhouse religion, the traditions that had guided Mohawks before Christianity.
And he began to hold socials and afterwards bring in kids. And, the songs and the ceremonies were restarted and people began to gather around the traditional longhouse once more. And that scared the hell out of the authorities. And so they really decided we have to crack down on the Mohawks. We have to stamp this out.
And in response, the Sulpicians began to turn the screws on Mohawks even more. One of their favorite methods was controlling the timber. Only Mohawks with special permission from the priests were allowed to cut down trees. If anyone else did, whether it was to heat their homes or to create lacrosse sticks to sell, the Sulpicians would sic the police on them.
We have records going back where we have a whole string of certain years where there were a lot of infants who died and were buried because their parents had been arrested and taken to jail for the crime of cutting wood to heat the homes, and they'd be left alone there.
Like his father before him and so many other Mohawks, Joseph Gabriel was charged with illegally cutting timber.
My grandfather actually took off and he said, "To hell with this. This is ridiculous. This is stupid." And so he challenged the church directly in several different ways.
Joseph Gabriel became a fugitive. At one point, he traveled to England to try to put the issue of Mohawk lands directly to the King of England, but he wasn't granted an audience. He returned to North America, but became a constant thorn in the side of the Sulpicians and Quebec authorities.
My aunt used to tell me, Kahsennahawi's daughter, used to tell me that they'd be sitting there sometimes just having supper and somebody would knock on the door and my great-grandfather would get up and run out. And literally, almost moments later, the police would barge in and start grabbing them, pointing guns at their heads, at their mother's head and at the kids' heads, drag them outside, search the whole place looking for him, but he was already gone.
When a railroad was being built through Kanehsatake, Joseph Gabriel came out of hiding to try to stop it. Gabriel and some of his followers rode in on horseback and threatened the construction crew building the line.
When I was a school kid, I used to get on the bus and I'd go past the tracks that just seemed to end on one side of the highway and they didn't continue on the other side. And I asked my mother one day, like, why? What happened there? And she said that my great-grandfather, her grandfather, gathered a whole bunch of men. They took off on horseback, carried their rifles, went out and confronted the construction crews that were building the railroad. And they made a lot of noise, whoop, 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 shot in the air, and drove off the construction crew, and they never came back.
After a dozen years on the run, he eventually turned himself in. The charges were largely dropped, but at the end of his life, he was jailed for refusing to send his children to residential schools. One of those children was Dan David's grandmother, Lena Nicholas. She too fought the whittling down of Kanehsatake. By this point, the Sulpicians had left and sold their land to a Belgian businessman. One day, Lena discovered some men cutting down trees on the Mohawk common land.
And when she found out that they were going to come in and do clear cutting, she just blew a gasket. She went down there. She challenged the Belgian and she said, you have no right, absolutely no right to be here and cutting. You're violating your very own law. He hit her. He made the big mistake of hitting my grandma. My grandma was a scrapper. She was small, but she was tough. And I think I've written once of her having that stare that would scare little kids and dogs. And I mean, that's what she was. She was not going to just walk away. If he hit her, she was going to fight back. And she did. And he picked up a chain and started whipping her. And she fought back. She refused to back down.
The next day, Lena Nicholas was arrested and charged. Her trial was conducted entirely in French, a language she didn't speak, and she was eventually convicted and fined a large sum of money.
So my grandmother became a criminal.
For Dan David and so many other Mohawks, this was the history that was passed down to them.
Growing up, those were the kinds of stories that we had. They weren't stories about this war or that war. It was always about these individual people who were willing to put their bodies on the line to do stuff to stand up for their individual rights.
The fight over the golf course didn't start in 1990. It started in the 1950s when the first 9 holes were built on Mohawk land.
All of a sudden there was a fence and a golf course appeared and nobody seemed to want to do anything about it. It was there. It was a fait accompli.
By this time, the land was no longer owned by the church.
And before the initial first 9 holes of the golf course was built, before that golf course went up, it went all the way to the House of Commons. You know, there were demands before legislators then to say, how can you let this golf course, a private club, by the way, be built when the claims of the Mohawks to this forest, this pine forest, still have not been resolved.
When developers wanted to expand the golf course and add an additional 9 holes, few of the white residents of Oka could recall that the course had been the target of protests when it was first constructed.
I think by the late 1980s, people living in and around Oka had forgotten that 30 years before, when the first 9 holes of the golf course was built, that there had been huge protests about that they'd gone all the way to Parliament.
At the time, Kanehsatake was a divided community. A small but increasing number of people were traditionalists, followers of the Longhouse religion that Dan David's great-grandfather helped revive. That was how Dan grew up, but it wasn't easy.
It was really messed up growing up here at Kanehsatake, and probably in a lot of other communities as well. We were called boogie woogies, and we were voodoo and witchcraft and all the rest of it by people who had converted over to Christianity. There was all that sense of pride, but at the same time, there was that sense of shame that was being pushed into you constantly, not just by, the people on the outside, but by people here, Mohawks, in the community.
Jean Ouellette, the mayor of Oka, used those divisions as an excuse to push forward the golf course development without the consent of the Mohawks.
When people would ask the mayor, Jean Ouellette, well, what about the Mohawks? Have you consulted them? His response was, oh, well, the Indians, they'll never agree to anything. There's no point in consulting them.
The people who occupied the Pines were a minority in Kanehsatake, and most of them were Longhouse people. And even if many Mohawks didn't support their actions, there was one question they were absolutely united on.
Everyone in Kanehsatake, regardless of their affiliation, supported the land claim, supported the right of the Mohawk to defend what was their unceded territory.
So when the SQ raided on July 11th, the people of Kanehsatake were united in the revulsion of the police. But they were also terrified.
Everybody expected a bloodbath, that there was going to be a counterattack. The police were going to move in greater force than before and come at you from different sides.
After the Mohawks at Kahnawake had blocked the Mercier Bridge, causing total commuter chaos, the provincial government stepped in and pulled back the SQ. Dan David remembers how strange it was those first few days after the raid. He'd see people he recognized in fatigues with bandanas wrapped around their faces.
These people weren't warriors. They were people that I grew up with. They were people who, in some cases, just as confused as my brother, Joe. They were just wanting to exist, to earn a living, to raise a family. And yet here they were, sitting there with weapons, sometimes ridiculously stupid weapons like 22s. I mean, what are you going to do with the 22 against an AK-47?
But what bolstered them and what gave them hope was the blockade at the Mercier Bridge, held together by their compatriots in Kahnawake.
There was a huge sigh of relief when that happened, because we knew that there wasn't going to be a second attack. We didn't feel so alone all of a sudden. Up until that point, we did feel so alone. We felt isolated. We felt trapped. And we felt, like the world was closing in around us at the time.
This bridge was crucial to the people on the sort of South Shore in Montreal, especially people of Chateauguay.
That's Geoffrey York, a journalist at the Globe and Mail. He co-authored People of the Pines with Loreen Pindera.
By blocking the bridge, it basically had a huge impact on thousands of people living on the south side of the river and made their lives a lot more difficult, sort of sealed off access to Kahnawake so they could defend their territory, and really sent a signal to the province and the country that the Mohawks would do everything they could, wherever they could, to put pressure on the government to take action and resolve this dispute.
And it wasn't just other Mohawks who stood with the people at Kanehsatake. Just a few weeks before the SQ raid, the Meech Lake Accords, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's first attempt to get Quebec to sign onto the Constitution, fell apart. And it was killed by Indigenous leaders in Manitoba who felt that they had been ignored during the process. The failure of Meech Lake meant that for once, Indigenous issues were at the top of the Canadian agenda. And the resolve of the Mohawks became an inspiration across the country.
Which is why when the crisis began, when the standoff began on July 11th, 1990, there was such an outpouring of support across the country. There was barricades that were thrown up by Indigenous people in many parts of the country. A number of activists and leaders and ordinary people from First Nations communities across the country came in to join the Mohawk warriors and to support them.
Good evening. There were at least 4 demonstrations across the country today, including this one on Parliament Hill, supporting the Mohawks at Oka.
Many Indigenous people came to Quebec to join the Mohawks in their protests. Some even picked up guns and joined the warriors. Despite the support they had, the Mohawks still had to face down the SQ, who are now on a revenge mission. The SQ strategy right from the beginning was to deny people access to food and medicine to try to get them to leave. What had begun as a firefight had turned into a siege.
The police came down and then they basically backed off and decided they were going to starve us out. They made it extremely difficult to pass through the lines, to go shopping for food, for instance, if you wanted to stay, to go to the doctor or to get medicine, a prescription filled. They would stop everybody, take everything coming into the community, throw it into the ditch.
The SQ had lost one of their men, and many of the officers seethed with anger. The police force already had a reputation for anti-Indigenous racism. But Mohawks who tried to go past the blockade to get to their homes were often humiliated by the cops. Children and elderly people had guns pointed at them. Food and other essential supplies were discarded on the street.
They made people strip out in the middle of the road in front of everybody. They took some people into custody, took them into the back and beat the crap out of them. It was pretty hard, and what they were basically saying is you can leave, but you can't come back in with anything. You can't come back in at all. And they were trying not just to starve the community out, but also to drive people out by being as harsh as possible.
Mohawks and Quebecois allies set up food smuggling networks to ensure people in Kanehsatake didn't starve. And getting access to medical treatment was also extremely difficult.
And I know some people who passed away early because of heart problems or they had diabetes and they couldn't get medicine.
Eventually, after significant lobbying, the Red Cross was allowed to enter with food and medical supplies. But even then, it wasn't enough. At Kahnawake, the tensions were ramping up just as fast. White residents of Chateauguay, the South Shore suburb that was cut off from the city by the blockade, were enraged.
People who were frustrated at not being able to use the bridge were showing up as close as they could get to the bridge, and there were huge demonstrations. You know, the burning of Robert Bourassa, the premier's effigy, and the burning of effigies of the Mohawks.
Every day, crowds of dozens and then hundreds of residents would show up to the police line and vent their frustrations. They screamed at the government and the police for not doing anything about the barricades. Some of them began to verbally and physically assault journalists who were viewed as tools of the Anglo power structure. And they would scream racial slurs and genocidal rhetoric towards the Mohawks.
It's not our fault if they don't have anything to eat. It's their fault. Yeah. That's it.
Notre mécontentement, vous avez ces maudits warriors là. Ce sont tous des maudits terroristes.
The hate fests were egged on by French-language talk radio hosts, and they quickly devolved into violence. On July 14th, just 3 days after the occupation of the Mercier Bridge began, a Mohawk woman from Kahnawake was attacked by a mob while she was trying to shop for groceries. Later on, an ambulance that was trying to enter the reserve was attacked, and 2 random men were beaten because the mobs mistakenly thought they were Mohawk. The SQ used these attacks to stop people from going in and out of Kahnawake, leading to food shortages there too. By then, the Oka Crisis had become the biggest story in the country, and political leaders were negotiating to try to bring it to an end. The federal government offered to buy the land for the golf course so that it wouldn't be developed. But by that point, it wasn't just about the real estate anymore. The Mohawks in both Kanehsatake and Kahnawake wanted something more. They wanted recognition of the Mohawk nation as a sovereign entity, something that they had in the United States. And they wanted the Canadian government to recognize their title to their land. That was a line that the federal government refused to cross.
There were no negotiations. They were stalling. They were basically waiting until public opinion changed. Every time that there were talks, between the people in the community and outside authorities to negotiate some kind of a peaceful resolution, the people who were so-called negotiators on the other side would say, well, we can't do anything. We can't make any decisions. We can't come down and say yes to this, that, or the other thing.
Geoffrey York was reporting from Ottawa when the crisis erupted.
I remember going to a supposedly off-the-record briefing. The federal government called in the journalists in Ottawa and said, this is off the record, just for background. And then at this briefing, trying to, tell us that it all had to be off the record, but basically trying to spin the media, they began arguing that all of these members of the Warrior Society at Oka were basically criminals, cigarette smugglers, gun runners, and so on. And that this was nothing more than a kind of a criminal dispute where the rule of law, so-called, had to be established. And I remember coming out of that briefing and saying, they want us to report this without even saying who they are, without even being on the record.
Geoffrey convinced his editors that they shouldn't play this kind of game, and they published the names of the people in the government who were spinning that story. Despite the best efforts of various levels of government, public opinion at the beginning was on the side of the Mohawks.
If you think about it, it was quite remarkable that the Mohawks, many of them picked up weapons. They had guns on July 11th. They had guns throughout the standoff with the police and the army. And normally that would be kind of a disqualifier for Canadian public opinion, that, you can't support people with guns, right? But what happened was many, many Canadians could understand it. They saw it as basically self-defense.
But Robert Bourassa, the Premier of Quebec, became increasingly frustrated. At the beginning of August, he invoked the National Defence Act. The Canadian forces would be brought in to eventually replace the SQ. And instead of facing down the Quebec provincial police, the Mohawks of Kahnawake and Kanehsatake would now be up against the full might of a national army. During the siege of Kanehsatake, Dan David's uncle in Syracuse died. He was the only member of his family allowed to go to the funeral.
When I got back, I was driving through one of the back roads, hoping to avoid, the main blockades. And all of a sudden, I'm driving along this country road, flash, and I get blinded. And automatically, I made sure I had my hands high up on the steering wheel. And I just slowed down slowly until it came to a complete stop. And then the police stuck their weapons in my face, grabbed my papers, and then one of them said, "Hey, he's a journalist."
They reluctantly let him through.
Well, I went through Saint Benoit on the way back, and with this little town, it's about 5 or 6 miles away west of here. And I saw this military camp. I saw tents, and I saw tanks and APCs and artillery, and I was wondering, what the hell? You got all of this against basically a small group of people. I think there were in all something like 2,500 Canadian military that had been shipped down to control the Mohawks, not just at Kanehsatake, but Kahnawake as well.
The army took weeks to fully mobilize and only relieved the SQ from the barricades on August 20th. For many Mohawks, the departure of the SQ was a relief.
They were a lot more organized. They were a lot less brutal at the checkpoints. They were a lot stricter about who could get in and who could get out than before, but they at least weren't as brutal as the SQ were. The SQ were just so totally out of control. With the military, it was a lot more organized and a lot more clear about what the rules were.
But the military was also more determined to take full control of the situation. They instituted stricter conditions on who could enter and leave. And while they let Dan David cross the lines, they tried to keep most other journalists out. Geoffrey York had to sneak past the military to get to Kanehsatake. He was able to make it inside by the end of August and was one of around a dozen journalists who witnessed what happened in the final days of the Oka Crisis. The majority of the Quebec cabinet was in favor of an immediate military raid, but the Canadian forces said that that would be a disaster. They viewed the Mohawk warriors as an organized paramilitary force that could do significant damage. And while the warriors certainly had men and guns, they were severely outmatched by the Canadian soldiers. So they resorted to trickery to maintain an advantage.
The Mohawks were always going to be outnumbered and outgunned. They had nothing that could stand up to the Canadian military. So they were instead using a lot of psychological tactics.
Warriors would make a show of marching across the road and then would quickly change clothes and march back the other way, making it appear that there were more of them. They would carefully handle large cloaked bundles of sticks, and the armed forces were convinced that those were rocket launchers. At Kahnawake, the Canadian commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robin Gagnon, treated the Mohawk warriors like professional soldiers. He crossed into no man's land on the first day and shook hands with some of the warriors, a move that was viewed as a betrayal by the mobs at Chateauguay. The two sides would meet periodically to ensure that no accidents happened. At Kanehsatake, the situation was more tense. Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Daigle took a more aggressive approach, and the warriors in the pines were more suspicious of the army. Despite their different approaches, the results were the same. Both Kanehsatake and Kahnawake were increasingly cut off from the rest of the world by the army.
This was 1990. There were not very many cell phones, but a few of us did have these big, clunky mobile phones, and we were able to use those to file daily reports. What happened was the Canadian government was able to kind of very quietly get a legal order to allow the mobile numbers to be deactivated and turned off, basically. So kind of one by one, all these mobile phones that we were using to get our reports out were being quietly and secretly turned off.
In Kahnawake, the Mohawk community was exhausted. They were trapped on the reserve and surrounded by angry white Quebecers who would attack any Mohawk they came across. Food was running low, and it became near impossible for the doctors and nurses who worked at the Kahnawake hospital to make their way there.
They had people who had lost jobs and were never going to get them back. Their economy was ruined. Their people were starving in some cases.
On August 27th, Premier Robert Bourassa demanded that the army dismantle the barricades immediately. Many families in Kahnawake were terrified that their community was about to be attacked by Canadian soldiers. They urged women, children, and elderly people to flee. A convoy of cars, around 75 of them, began to leave Kahnawake at 2 p.m. the next day. The Canadian forces detained them for 2 hours, searching every inch of every car. And as they were stranded there, French-language talk radio hosts urged Quebecers to assemble near the bridge. By the time the cars were allowed to go through, more than 400 people had gathered.
They were so angry, and frankly, there was a level of racism, and they were throwing stones at women and children as they went out of Kahnawake looking for food, basically, or trying to get out of this standoff.
The police did nothing to stop the mob from pelting the Mohawks with bricks and stones. One rock crashed through a car window, hitting a 76-year-old man in the chest. Another elderly man, Joe Armstrong, died of a heart attack shortly after. His family blamed the stress of the attacks. Over the next 2 days, secret negotiations took place to bring an end to the blockade of the Mercier Bridge. People in Kahnawake were exhausted, out of food, and the golf club development had been cancelled. They believed that their point had been made. And on August 30th, Mohawk warriors and Canadian forces dismantled the barricades together. After 2 months, the Mercier Bridge was finally open. But when the people in the pines heard about what had happened, they were despondent.
It was a tremendous sense of betrayal because they had come and they had basically saved Kanehsatake from an impending attack that everybody knew was going to happen. And afterwards, when all this was going on, after the blockade was down over on the Mercier Bridge, such a sense of betrayal that somebody had struck a deal. They hadn't really suffered like a lot of the people at Kanehsatake had.
The communication lines between Kanehsatake and Kahnawake had long been dismantled. They didn't see then how much Kahnawake was suffering too.
We didn't understand that they were being starved out as well, that they were being hassled, that they had riots happening all along their border, and that they were hanging on by their fingertips as well.
With the Mercier Bridge now open to traffic, the Mohawks lost their most important bargaining chip. Now, it was only a matter of time before the siege was over. But the warriors in Kanehsatake, they refused to surrender. They weren't planning on making it easy on the army. Behind the barricades, many feared for the worst.
I was at the gym. I had helped set up the food bank, and I had watched as the Red Cross brought in all kinds of things like body bags, expecting, if there was going to be any shooting going on, that the military were going to fire back and people would get killed. So we understood that. We understood that probably too well because any kind of bodies would be removed and we'd have to take care of them at the school gym, at the food bank.
Beginning on September 1st, the army began to slowly move into the pines, foot by foot, and they didn't come alone.
Worst of all was the fact that when the army moved through and set up their roadblocks and squeezed towards the pines, the SQ moved in. The SQ came through like, they wanted to be a conquering army behind the army itself. So they started parading through the community, driving their little convoys past the schoolhouse. That's what people were afraid of, that the police would come in afterwards and start hauling individuals out.
The army eventually took down the barricades and pushed up into Kanehsatake. Their ultimate destination was a Mohawk treatment center that had become the base of operation for the warriors. That's where Geoffrey was staying with a handful of other journalists who remained. It wasn't long before the army had the treatment center surrounded.
The Mohawks were on one side, on the treatment center side. They had a patch of forest on their side. They had razor wire and a kind of a tarpaulin sheet to shield them from these very intense military spotlights that the army was using from their armored vehicles to sort of cast a spotlight over the entrance of the road that led into the treatment center, which is where the standoff was physically happening. So on the other side, that's where there was a number of soldiers. The lights were so bright coming in from the military side, these intense spotlights and floodlights that the military was using, that it was difficult to see across the road and to know how many soldiers there were, how many vehicles there were. So, being on the Mohawk side, you just saw this bright flash of light trained onto the Mohawks. And then you saw the Mohawks themselves, the warriors and their supporters and so on, sort of manning this barricade to ensure that the soldiers did not try to move in.
The warriors and the soldiers would face off 24 hours a day.
Your people are throwing eggs at us, so apparently you have too much food.
You gotta go home and live with yourself. You gotta go home and talk to your children too, huh? I'm a terrorist. You guys better go home and re-educate yourself. Come on, Canada's using you.
And without television cameras around, the soldiers shed their professional veneer.
They went in on one case on a kind of a reconnaissance patrol, grabbed one of the Mohawks and started beating him up. He was quite severely injured. That led to a lot of fear because, nobody knew if this was just the first episode in a more aggressive strategy perhaps by the soldiers, and they might start coming in and doing more of this. There was also a few times where the electricity was turned out as a pressure tactic, and nobody knew when the electricity went out. Did that mean that the guns were going to come in? Were they turning off the lights late at night, turning off the electricity because there was going to be a military assault? And a lot of people were worried about that. And of course, if you're a journalist hearing that fear, you feel it as well. You feel that, maybe there is going to be an assault.
The people who remained in the treatment center, though, weren't just warriors from Kanehsatake. Some were Mohawks from Kahnawake and Aguasasne. Others were Mi'kmaq or Cree or Kwakiutl. And some weren't warriors at all. Women and children also remained there, waiting to see what the army would do, hoping it wouldn't come to bloodshed. Dan David was at the gym nearby. His brother Joe was in the treatment center with the other warriors.
And there were times when we could actually hear explosions. We didn't know what they were coming from. We didn't know what was happening down there. We were afraid that we would start seeing bodies come out, and these bodies would be our relatives, our family members, including my brother. How do you put that into words? How do you, describe that feeling? A mixture of anger, of fear, of all mixed up into one.
On one of the final days of the siege, after the army had killed the electricity, Joe David, Dan David's brother, went to the basement where the journalists were staying. He picked up a book and started to read it by flashlight, silently at first, and then he began to read out loud. It was Wilfred Owen, the World War I poet who wrote about the horrors of combat. The journalists listened on as Joe David, the pacifist who had picked up a gun, recited Owen's words about that old lie that it is good and noble to die for one's country. When he was done, no one said a word. Over a week later, the warriors decided it was time to end the occupation. But even then, they refused to surrender.
The strategy of the Mohawks on the day that they came out was to basically walk home. That they felt that they had done nothing wrong, certainly nothing illegal. They had made a stand. They had decided to end the stand, so they were going to walk home. And they all came out and began walking down the road. By the time the soldiers realized what was going on, they were halfway down the road. And so the soldiers were racing over and trying to arrest them and ending up in battles or fights with some of these guys, and including with some of these children.
Wanique Horn Miller was a teenager in the 10th grade. And as she ran out of the treatment center, she was holding her 4-year-old sister, Ganye Tio, in her arms. The soldiers told her to stop, but she kept going. And then one of them stabbed her with his bayonet. Wanique was stabbed inches from her heart, but luckily she survived. The soldiers took most of the warriors into custody, and some of them they served up to the Sûreté du Québec. At least 2 of them were severely beaten by SQ officers while in custody. From the perspective of Canada, the crisis was now over. The standoff had lasted 78 days. Dan David remembers how he felt when he heard that no one had been killed at the end, that his brother was safe.
I felt grateful. I felt grateful for my parents that they didn't have to bury one of us. I also had a very strange sense that it would be for nothing. This was an event that I think shook the country to the core. But I was afraid that as far as Quebec was concerned, that nothing would change, that they would just simply turn the page back and pretend that it never happened. I just had that feeling, that somehow it would mean more to the rest of Canada, but not to Quebec, that they would pretend that it never happened, and they would try to turn the clock back to pre-Oka Crisis. And that's one of the strangest feelings I've had out of that whole freaking summer, was that they wouldn't learn anything or change anything. And I think I was right.
Over 150 Mohawks were criminally charged, and only around 15 people were charged for their involvement in the stone throwing at Châteauguay. For the people of Kanehsatake, they had successfully stopped the golf course from being developed, but they paid a high price.
A lot had happened in the community. And there was tremendous internal feelings. The community imploded emotionally, psychologically, politically, economically. It just imploded. It was beaten down. And you saw some of the worst characters in this community take over the community. You had drugs, you had guns, you had gangs, you had goons.
His brother Joe went on to be a successful artist, but in 1999, he was shot and paralyzed by Mohawk peacekeepers at his home after he got into an altercation with a youth ATVing on his property. He died in 2004. Dan David was pulled back into journalism. He became the founding news director of APTN News. We spoke to him just a week after he received the CJF Lifetime Achievement Award. But even now, Dan finds that the people in Kanehsatake don't want to talk about the events of 1990. There's too much pain on all sides.
It's like those penguins, in Madagascar. You saw nothing. And so there was this whole sense that we have to just forget it, forget about what happened.
But across Canada, Oka became a template for Indigenous peoples, and an example of the lengths the Canadian state is willing to go to deny Indigenous title and sovereignty.
People saw that the federal government was willing to use force, basically, and propaganda techniques and legal delaying techniques to prevent justice from happening on land issues and on self-government issues. And the fact that the warriors picked up guns and were willing to use them, were willing to face off against the police and later against the military, shows that maybe Canada wasn't that different from the United States, that Canada is not just a peaceful country where everything can be worked out in a mature way. Sometimes self-defense is necessary.
But the Kanehsatake common land has never been returned to the Mohawks. In 2018, when a developer proposed giving it to the Band Council, the mayor of Oka complained that the city would be, quote, surrounded by Mohawks with illegal cigarette shops and garbage dumps. And even if the land was returned, it would go to the Band Council, a creature of the Indian Act and of Canadian colonialism. Dan David doesn't know if the sovereignty of the Mohawk Nation will ever be recognized by Canada.
They've been denying that basic argument for the last 400 years. I doubt that they're going to change now.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that episode, subscribe to this channel. And also consider subscribing to our main channel to find exclusive videos and behind-the-scenes content that you can't get anywhere else. And finally, we're an audience-supported network, so if you care about the work that we do, become a supporter. You'll get access to new ad-free episodes, discounts on our merch, tickets to live events, and so much more. Just go to CanadaLand.com/join.